The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills. And then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuity. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in the reciprocal relationship, the relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that, we mean what we refer to as the serve and return, the nature of children's interaction with their and adults' development, and the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street, it's a back-and-forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialized in different kinds of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So, if a child is emotionally kind of well put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference.
A non-governmental organization, NGO, is an organization that is neither a part of a government nor a conventional for-profit business. Usually set up by ordinary citizens, NGOs may be funded by governments, foundations, businesses, or private persons. Some avoid formal funding altogether and are run primarily by volunteers. NGOs are highly diverse groups of organizations engaged in a wide range of activities, and take different forms in different parts of the world. Some may have charitable status, while others may be registered for tax exemption based on recognition of social purposes. Others may be fronts for political, religious, or other interests. The number of NGOs in the United States is estimated at 1.5 million. Russia has 277,000 NGOs. India is estimated to have had around 2 million NGOs in 2009, just over 1 NGO per 600 Indians, and many times the number of primary schools and primary health centers in India. NGOs are difficult to define, and the term NGO is rarely used consistently. As a result, there are many different classifications in use. The most common focus is on orientation.
But we can really thank the Great Exhibition of 1851 for giving us the world's premier taxi service, for it was going to this exhibition, and this fabulous exhibition inventions from all around the four corners of the empire that the visitors were appalled, dismayed and vexed by their journeys to this exhibition because the cabbies of the day, and their horse-drawn carts were absolutely terrible, could not find their way to this exhibition. And, so, a great public outcry, the London Authority sets up Public Carriage Office, which is an organization that still exists. And you can take a short walk to Penton Street up the road. And this Public Carriage Office took on the responsibility of licensing all major taxi drivers in London. All taxi drivers from 1851 onwards had to pass what is now known as the London Knowledge, was phenomenal knowledge of London. What is the London Knowledge? It's the ability to remember the 25,000 streets, have it all interconnected and all the main arterial roads in and out of London. Cabbies need to know all this plus 1,000 points of specific interest: cafes, bars, public offices. They need to know them all as part of their training. The powerful influence of Stevenson's text on the discourse of dissociation is strikingly apparent in the work of American physician and psychologist Morton Prince. Reber credits Prince with pioneering the phenomenon of popularizing MPD as embodied in a spectacular case. Prince's Dissociation of a Personality, 1905, tells the story of Miss Christine Beecham, a pseudonym for Clara Norton Fowler, who, according to Prince, is a person in whom several personalities have become developed.
The shuttle was designed to be a space truck. It's a multi-purpose vehicle. We've done a tremendous number of different things with it. It's the most versatile space vehicle that has ever been built. We've used it to launch satellites. We've used it to repair satellites in orbit and put them back into orbit. We've used it to capture satellites and bring them back to Earth for repair. We've outfitted it with the Space Lab built by our European partners and used it before the era of the space station to do scientific research. We used it as part of our partnership with the Russians, which is still continuing, first as part of the Mir space station, where we actually prolonged the useful life of Mir by several years through logistical supply visits with the shuttle. And now, of course, we're using it to build the new International Space Station, which is a huge international partnership.
Thermodynamics is the science of the flow of heat. So, thermo is heat, and dynamic is the motion of heat. Thermodynamics was developed largely beginning in the 1800s, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. So, taming of steel. It was the beginning of generating power by burning fossil fuels. The beginning with the problems with CO2 and global warming. In fact, it's interesting to note that the first calculation on the impact of the CO2 on climate was done in the late 1800s by Arrhenius. It was the beginning of a generation of power moving heat from fossil fuels to generating energy, locomotives, etc. So, he calculated what would happen to this burning of fossil fuels, and he decided in his calculation, he basically got the calculation right, by the way, that in 2000 years from the time that he did the calculations, human would be in trouble.
All of my research and that I conducted was my 60+ graduate students, was motivated by their need to learn, so that we can teach. Of course, in some inventions happened along the way, but I've always considered the end the result. And I always consider that this invention to be byproducts of the learning process. The end product for me was always better understanding, or when one really succeeded in unifying theory that can help us in teaching the subject. I've also looked at teaching as a vehicle to try new ideas, of new ways to doing things on an intelligent group of learners. That is as the vehicle for the teaching research results. And in my experience, this kind of teaching is the most stimulated and motivating to students. I am also uncovered many interesting research problems as the cause of teaching assumption. It is this unity of research and teaching, their close connection and the benefits gathered by exercising and the interplay that to me recognized the successful professor.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you had the term robot, but I'm going to show you the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots, and the play was written by Czech writer called Karl Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War, it finished, had a devastating impact across Europe, and so people are kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kinds of question. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So even though they are human, they are assembled and these robots are designed to labor, and that is their primary purpose in society.
I have said before that you can't have a civilization that doesn't have art. When we think about the great civilizations historically, all of them had a great production of culture and art because a society did not fail to observe itself. The sophistication of the great civilizations were their ability to look at themselves. What exactly allows a society to do to be the producers of art and culture and to mirror back to the core of the society? What is being produced at that moment? How do people think of themselves, and how are the individuals relating to the social structure at that time? Art is the vehicle in which guides us towards understanding what we were to take away from art. What would be that mirror? How do we see what we are about? How would we understand what was going on in Paris at the time of the Impressionists when people were learning to see in a completely different way? Before cinematography and similar link that were invented, people looked at the world in a very different way, which was considered very radical at that time. There's sugar in a lot of foods where you don't expect it. Of course, there's lots of sugar in donuts, of ice cream, or pastries, or other things that are sweet, candy of course, but there are other places where you see it and you don't necessarily expect it. So as an example, peanut butter. Here's a list of ingredients from Skippy peanut butter and you see that sugar is the second most common ingredient. So that you may know from the reading food labels that these ingredients in any food labels that are listed in order of how much there is in the food itself, so sugar comes right after peanuts. Here's another example, beef stew. You wouldn't necessarily expect it to find sugar in beef stew, but it's there. Now it's down a list of ingredients, it's actually toward the end, but if you look at the marketing of this and food at the can, it says, there's fresh potatoes and carrots, but actually there's more sugar in this than there is carrots, and so you wouldn't eat something like beef stew and expect to find this to be the case.
Turner, not surprisingly, painted one of the earliest pictures of London's fog in this 1835 painting, the Thames above Waterloo Bridge. Turner, as a true born Londoner, is advertising his familiarity with London's problem by putting smoke and atmospheric pollution at its centre. And as you can see and hear, the bridge is the central element, which is a theme that's later taken up by Monet and is partly obscured by the steam and smoke which rises from both sides of the river. Here we see a shot tower, I think you can just about see it, which was constructed in 1826. Do you know what shakis are? They produce shotguns and munition, and they were very smoky. One of the most smoking industries, but it's barely visible as you can see, as are the various industries on the Lambeth side of the river. There's on this side. There's a steamship about to dock or preparing to leave. It's black smoke thrusting up to join the kind of swirling arc of smoke there. William Rodner sees this painting as a potent essay on the energy and complexity of modern polluted urbanism. Smoke, I think, here represents a flourishing economy which brings employment and food on tables, but also the dirt and pollution associated with it, fumes. All seems to be tainted by sulphurous yellow. Even the black plumes of smoke from the two funnels of the steam eye have yellow streaks in them to give them a greater sense of movement and vitality.
But when we move into working with communities, we have to recognize that the communities have to be the authority in their language. Actually, a woman in the class I'm teaching at Sydney at the moment, a career woman, expressed this very nicely. Although she was talking about something else, she was distinguishing expertise from authority. And certainly linguists, because of our training, we do have expertise in certain very narrow areas of language. But we don't have the authority over what to do with that knowledge or what to do with other knowledge that the community produces. I guess for me the bottom line is languages are lost because of the dominance of one people over another. That's not rocket science. It's not hard to work that out. But then what that means is if in working with language revival we continue to hold the authority, we actually haven't done anything towards undoing how languages are lost in the first place. So in a sense the languages are still lost if the authority is still lost.
So when we talk about the paleo regions, just to clarify exactly what we mean, and we have first of all the Arctic at the top of Earth and Antarctic at the bottom. And so the Arctic was named after the Greek word for bear. Surprisingly, it is not after the polar bears that live in the Arctic. It is after the Little and Great Bear constellations that can be seen in the sky. Now, the Greeks also hypothesized that there would be an anti-Arctic, which is how we get the name Antarctica. Of course, it wasn't discovered until much later on. Now, these regions are opposite in many ways other than just their names and their location on the globe. So if we look at the Arctic first of all, the Arctic is actually ocean surrounded by land. So you can see here, this is the UK down here, and this is Russia, and then America, Canada around here. So there is a bit of land covered in ice on top in the Arctic, which is Greenland here. All these areas here, surprisingly, a lot of people don't realize that this is not actually land. North Pole isn't on land, it is just one big ocean. So if you have to gauge the North Pole, you can stand on it. If you were to drill down through the ice, you would find ocean beneath it.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you had the term robots, but I'm gonna show you the very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots, and the play was written by a Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute cuddly toys or, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War. It finished and had a devastating impact across Europe, and so people are kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human? What makes us human? Those kinds of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line. a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So even though they are human, they are assembled, and these robots are designed to labor, and that is their primary purpose in society.
You can see that the two charts each give quite a different picture of the performance of boys and girls in the two key subjects of maths and English. It shows that in English, girls consistently outperform boys over a period of 6 years, achieving scores about 10% above their male peers. There is quite a different picture when we look at the math result with no real difference between genders in the results. What is the explanation for these key differences? To answer this question, researchers look at biological and cognitive factors and a range of social factors. The interaction between these different components in early childhood development are seen as maintained and reinforced in the school context, and this leads to distinct gender patterns of behavior in skills with direct consequences for school performance and achievement. The argument uses this evidence to show that biological factors such as patterns of cognitive development are closely linked to social factors such as learned gender categories. These cognitive skills are learned through preschool and subsequently at school, supported by the responses of teachers, creating a reinforcement of patterns.
This is Hans Krebs, who in 1937 published a paper showing the sequence of chemical reactions by which energy is released in individual cells. It is called the Krebs cycle, which some of you may remember from your chemistry course in your high school. Krebs is a wonderful example to me of how a scientist who is determined can overcome all kinds of human obstacles. Krebs's father constantly discouraged him and told him that he had just mediocre intelligence whenever to anything important in his life as a teenager. What Krebs remembers in his memoir, his father said to him, "You can't make a silk purse that sews your backslash." And later on, when Krebs studied with the great biochemist Otto Warburg, Warburg also told him the same thing. Not the same quote, but that he had only mediocre ability and would never be a great scientist. And we all hear about how important it is for parents to encourage their children. But sometimes the children will go on to do great things no matter what we say to them.